The air inside the abandoned rail depot tasted of rust and old rain, as if the building exhaled a metallic sorrow each time the wind pressed against its fractured windows. Darkness settled here like a permanent tenant, patient, unmoving, heavy with unspoken memory. And in the first 100 breaths of night, when the investigator stepped through the crooked doorway, the world contracted into a narrow pulse of shadows and silence. It was the sort of silence that didn't simply fill the room, it remembered things. It held onto them the way cold soil holds onto the shape of whatever was buried beneath. He paused, letting the gloom draw its edges around him. Dust spiraled down from the rafters in threads so slow they looked suspended, like they had been falling since 1999 and still hadn't reached the floor. His flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied, illuminating fragments. Peeling paint curled like withered petals, boards warped from long-evaporated floods, rails half-swallowed by weeds that crept in through every crack. The depot wasn't large, but it felt vast, as though the walls had stretched themselves to hide the ghosts that clung to them. This place, the last known sighting of, had fermented in his mind for years. He had visited once back when he was too green to understand the weight certain rooms could carry. Now, returning felt like stepping back into a dream he had spent half his life trying to wake from. Age 24. A voice soft enough to soothe arguments, stubborn enough to summon storms. A life swallowed by a night that didn't want witnesses. Her name drifted through the depot like a chill, as if the structure itself whispered it beneath the groan of the settling beams. The investigator, Hale, had promised himself he would never come back here alone, but promises were thin veins in him now, fragile and easily severed. Something in the case file he had reopened, some subtle shift in the shadows of memory, had told him he had missed something, or maybe the silence had. His boots touched the floorboards with muted thuds, sending small tremors through the building. The echoes returned to him in delayed fragments, like distant replies from someone too tired to speak fully. Found himself apologizing to the air for the intrusion. The depot still smelled of creosote, damp cloth, and the faint sweetness of decayed wood. He remembered that smell from the last investigation team. How unfamiliar it was, how it clung to his jacket for days. But now, after everything since then, it felt almost intimate, like a memory that pressed a hand against the back of his neck, guiding him further inside. He swept his light across the far wall, revealing old chalk markings. They weren't evidence. Children had probably scribbled their years earlier, but the way they seemed to twist in the dimness made his breath slow. Shapes imitating grief, or warning, or accusation. He moved deeper, careful not to disturb anything. His steps threaded between debris, an overturned crate, a rusted lantern, a torn schedule from '98 that had fused to the floor like a fossil. Everything felt arranged somehow, not deliberately, but with the organic order of neglect. Places abandoned long enough began to curate themselves around the memories left inside. Exhaled, watching the vapor briefly cloud his flashlight beam. It was colder here than outside, too cold for spring. The temperature felt unnatural, like the room had been holding its breath for 2 decades. Something brushed his consciousness, not a sound, more like the idea of a sound. A faint, delicate shift of presence. He lifted the flashlight. The beam landed on a section of wall where the paint had darkened with moisture, forming a patch vaguely shaped like a silhouette leaning into the corner. He blinked. It was only a stain. But it was also a reminder of why he had lived half his career with this case knotted behind his ribs, because some absences felt alive. Silence deepened, carrying a quiet pressure that made him swallow hard. His pulse drummed in his ears, louder than any footsteps that had ever echoed through this depot. The air felt thick around him, as though it expected him to ask something he had never been brave enough to say aloud. And even before the object was found, before this night would bruise its way into another chapter, felt the shift, a reawakening in the dark, as if the depot had been waiting for him, holding onto a final truth it hadn't yet decided he deserved. He found it not by searching, but by misstep. A loose board near the center of the depot groaned beneath his weight, giving just enough to send a quiver of unease into his spine. Crouched, angling the flashlight as the wood bowed inward. Something beneath it caught the light, a dull glimmer, not metallic, not reflective, but the faint shimmer of something drowned in dust and time. He eased the board aside. Beneath it lay a small velvet pouch, crushed flat, its once deep burgundy now mottled with gray and mildew. He recognized the texture of the fabric instantly. Had been photographed with something similar, back in a picture taken the week before she vanished. A casual snapshot at a diner, her smile unguarded, her fingers brushing the pouch like it held something fragile or dangerous. His throat tightened with the weight of as he lifted it. The pouch was colder than the surrounding wood, as if it had been lying underwater rather than beneath floorboards. When he loosened the drawstrings, a soft, static whisper rose from inside, like the sigh of dust remembering light. A pendant slipped into his palm, a small glass teardrop wrapped in thin, tarnished silver wire. Inside the glass was a pressed forget-me-not, perfectly preserved, its petals frozen in their soft blue bloom. It was a delicate thing, too delicate for this place, and it hit with the force of a memory he had never admitted, had given him a flower once. A real forget-me-not, plucked from a roadside patch during their short-lived, almost genuine friendship, years before the case bound them differently. For luck, she'd said with a half-smile, or something like it. He had lost it, or claimed he had. But sometimes at night, in dream-shifted hours, he wondered whether he had thrown it away. This pendant, someone had preserved a flower for her, or she had preserved it herself. The question twisted inside him, a shape without clear edges. As he studied the glass, faint scratches on its surface came into view. Not random, not accidental. They formed a pattern, crisscrossed lines that resembled a map or a code, but nothing comprehensible at first glance. His pulse quickened. The pendant wasn't merely sentimental, it was symbolic, intentional, hidden deliberately beneath the floorboards of a place tied to her final hours. Why here, why now? Why after 2 decades of quiet? The depot seemed to lean closer, its immense hush drawing in around him. Shadows stretched along the floorboards, as though curious to see what he would do next. A faint echo startled him, just the wind squeezing through a broken pane, but in that whisper he could swear he heard his voice. Or maybe only the shape of her absence, the kind that had followed him for years, pressing at the edges of conversations, lingering behind every closed case file. He brought the pendant closer to the beam of his flashlight. The flower inside had not wilted, not even slightly. It looked as if it had been pressed yesterday. This impossibility rattled him. Objects in cold cases were supposed to fade, ink blurs, cloth frays, memories dissolve. Yet here was a piece of her, untouched by time, as though someone had been tending to it, protecting it, or waiting for him to find it. His breath fogged the glass, smearing the image of the flower. He wiped it with his sleeve, feeling the tremor in his hands. Had reopened the case because of a small inconsistency in the early witness statements, a detail that whispered wrongness. But this pendant was more than a clue. It was an intrusion into the past, and it was personal. He slid the pouch into his coat pocket, aware of the sudden heaviness there, as if the object carried its own gravity. The depot watched him with its half-broken windows, its sagging rafters, its hollowed silence. Something had returned. Something that didn't want to stay buried anymore. By the time stepped back into the night, the pendant felt like a pulse in his pocket, steady, intrusive, alive. The Pennsylvania air was thick with early spring moisture, mist coiling along the ground in pale ribbons that made the world look as though it were exhaling exhaustion. He walked toward his car slowly, as if the earth beneath him might give way under the weight of what he'd found. Obsession, he knew, rarely announced itself. It seeped in quietly, stitching itself to the softest places. His had begun the night disappeared, not because he was assigned to the case, but because he was. He was only 22 then, newly stationed, still wearing naivety like boots. Her disappearance shook the town, shook the department, shook him. And he couldn't explain why. Not fully. Something about her smile and the old photographs unsettled him. As though she saw people deeply, even when they didn't want to be seen. He used to pass her on the street sometimes. She always nodded. A simple acknowledgement given without hesitation or expectation. Yet he carried those nods with him like favors he had never returned. When her case went cold, found reasons to keep reading the file. For training purposes, he would say. For closure. Lies, all of them, woven tightly enough to masquerade as diligence. But there was another truth beneath them, one he hadn't allowed himself to look at directly. He felt responsible, not for her vanishing itself, but for the invisible space between them, the one that had remained unspoken until it collapsed into tragedy. He had told himself for years that what he felt was professional commitment. But the way his hand hovered over the pendant now told a different story. He reached his car, hesitating with the keys in his hand. The mist thickened, softening the edges of the trees, the telephone wires, the gravel road. Behind him, the depot sank into its own stillness again, but he felt it watching him, like it had whispered something to him that he wasn't yet brave enough to say aloud. When he slid into the driver's seat, he didn't start the engine immediately. He simply sat, listening to the faint ticking of the cooling metal, pulse syncing with the slow rhythm of silence outside. He pulled the pendant from his pocket. It glowed faintly under the dome light, the pressed flower inside almost luminous. Brushed the glass lightly with his thumb. "You should stayed away," he whispered, to the pendant, to himself, to the memory of her. But he couldn't. He remembered visiting her parents back then, how her mother's voice fractured mid-sentence, how her father gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles showed bone, had said he was sorry for their pain, but he never apologized for the guilt he didn't confess, the guilt of wondering whether he could have mattered too in some way that might have changed the night she vanished. He examined the pendant again, looking for meaning in the scratches. The pattern was unfamiliar yet insistent, like a map from a dream. He tried tracing it with his fingertip, but the harder he looked, the less sure he became whether the lines were real or imagined, whether they had always been there, whether he had seen them on the pouch in that diner photo long ago but failed to recognize their importance. Memory was unreliable, especially his. Leaned back, closing his eyes. Silence settled over him, thick and warm. When he breathed in, he tasted the old depot lingering on him. Rust would rot untold stories. Duty had brought him back to the case. But obsession was the reason he was still sitting here, unable to drive away. He opened his eyes. He murmured, the name tasting both familiar and forbidden. Somewhere in the fog, he imagined a figure watching him, not threatening, simply present, a shape shaped by absence. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He knew then the case wasn't pulling him back. She was. Or the version of her that existed in the space between memory and guilt, truth and imagination. Either way, wasn't merely investigating anymore. He was returning. returning to something he had never resolved in himself, something that had been haunting him long before he found the pendant beneath the depot floorboards. And as he finally started the engine, the quiet hum seemed to whisper an admission he didn't speak aloud. This wasn't duty. This was longing wearing a badge. The next morning, the town wore its age more honestly. Fog clung low over the narrow Pennsylvania streets, softening the edges of old brick buildings and shuttered storefronts. Familiar signs, diner, pharmacy, liquors, hung crooked, their colors leached by years of sun and indifference. Parked across from grocery, the family store that hadn't truly recovered from 1999. The open sign glowed in the front window, but behind the glass, the aisles were empty and dim, like a stage long after the audience had gone home. He sat in the car for a moment, listening to the faint rattle of an air conditioning unit struggling in the next building. The pendant rested cool against his chest now, the chain hastily looped around his neck before he left home. He hadn't meant to wear it. It had just ended up there, like some part of him believed it belonged close to his pulse. He told himself it was evidence. He told himself a lot of things. Inside the store, a bell on the door announced his arrival with a brittle ring. The voice came from behind the counter, dry and thin, like paper rubbed between fingers. Lydia's younger sister stood there with a ledger book open, pen hovering above the page. She had been 17 when vanished. Now in her 40s, she carried the disappearance around her eyes, in the way the skin there never quite relaxed. Her dark hair, once worn long to match her sister's, was cropped blunt at her jaw, streaked with early gray. She had become a geography of unfinished sentences. "You look tired," she said. It was not an observation so much as an accusation of the years. Offered a faint smile, occupational hazard. She closed the ledger, the pen ticking softly against the cover. Or certain cases you can't let go of. He swallowed, feeling the pendant press lightly against his sternum. "You heard I reopened it. This town hears everything." She tilted her head, examining him with the cool patience of someone used to disappointment. "But it rarely listens." There had been a time, not long after went missing, when it sat at this very counter with Lydia, both of them staring at the empty doorway, inventing reasons might still walk through it. Lydia had cried then, had pretended he was only there in a professional capacity. Neither lie had aged well. "I need to ask you about something," he said. "Again?" "Yes." He hesitated, then reached beneath his shirt, unclasping the pendant. The glass teardrop slid into his palm, the pressed flower pale and perfect under the store's washed-out light. Lydia's gaze locked on it, and something in her face flinched. "You found it," she whispered. The room felt suddenly smaller, shelves leaning inward, fluorescent lights humming with soft unease. "Where?" she asked. "Depot," he replied, "under the floorboards." Lydia's fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to reach for it. She was supposed to have it, she murmured, more to herself than to him. His voice dropped. She wore it often. Every day that last year. Lydia's eyes grew distant. Said it meant she could keep things alive. Moments, feelings. Said if you pressed something between glass and time, it couldn't be taken. She exhaled a bitter laugh. Guess she was wrong. Listened, absorbing the words like a confession carved from old bone. Who gave it to her? Lydia looked at him sharply. You don't remember. The question struck him like a cold slap. A faint buzzing sounded in his ears, as if the fluorescent lights had suddenly grown louder. I asked carefully. Lydia frowned, confusion flickering in her expression. She said it was from someone on the force, someone who told her it was for protection. Her eyes narrowed. I always assumed that was you. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. For a moment the shelves blurred, their labels smeared into color and suggestion. He felt the pendant in his palm, unnaturally heavy. "I never," he began, then the words tangled. Memories flashed in fragments at the diner, laughing in the grocery aisle, nodding to him on the street, her fingers brushing a small velvet pouch. Had he given it to her? No, he would remember that. He had to remember that. "Maybe she lied," Lydia said, voice thinning. "She lied about some things, you know, to protect people, to protect herself." She looked away, blinking hard. But she didn't deserve to vanish. Silence stretched between them, dense, almost tactile. Could hear the faint hum of a refrigerator in the back, the distant rumble of a truck passing outside, Lydia's careful breathing. The town moved around them, oblivious. "Why reopen it now?" she asked suddenly, gaze returning to him. "After all this time?" "New information," he said automatically. "And the real reason?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. Lydia's eyes softened, but in a way that hurt more than accusation. "You were always more involved than you admitted," she said. "Even back then, I could see it." She studied him quietly. "You talked about like you known her for years, but you hadn't, had you?" His jaw tensed. "We crossed paths." "That's not how you made it sound," she replied. "Sometimes I wondered if you'd built a whole person out of those crossings, like the town did. We all remade her over and over to fit the gaps we couldn't live with." She stepped around the counter, standing closer now. Up close, he could see the faint tremor in her hands, the way grief had etched itself into her posture. "Find out what happened," she said softly, "but be sure you're actually looking for the truth. Not just proof of whatever story you've been telling yourself." Their eyes locked. For a fleeting second he thought he saw there, an echo of her gaze, curious and wary as if weighing him. He left the store with the pendant back around his neck, and Lydia's words lodged like splinters under his skin. That evening he met another ghost made of flesh. The bar on the edge of town had changed names 3 times since '99, but the stale smell of beer and regret was timeless. Slid into a booth in the back, away from the neon signs and the low murmur of conversations. Across from him sat Mark's on-and-off boyfriend back then, now broader, grayer, eyes bleached of the easy charm they once carried. "You look like hell," Mark muttered, taking a sip from his glass. "Revisiting old scenes," said. "They don't age well." Mark snorted, "Join the club." They sat in silence for a moment, the condensation on Mark's glass trailing slow paths downward. The jukebox in the corner shuffled through songs that tried to be cheerful and failed. "You think I did it," Mark said eventually. "Not a question." "I think you were close to her," replied. "That matters." "Close," Mark's jaw tightened. "You know what close meant back then. It meant everyone thought I owned her." His fingers drummed on the table, then stopped, pressing flat against the wood. "I loved her," he said quietly, "just not in the kind of way that lasts." "You fought a lot," said. "Witnesses." "We were young, we were stupid, we were loud," Mark's eyes flashed. "That doesn't make me a killer." "No," conceded, "it doesn't." Mark studied him carefully. "You ever notice how everyone talks about like she belonged to them? My girl, my sister, my daughter, my friend. Even you, and you barely knew her." Flinched. "Yeah," Mark said. "She told me about you. The quiet cop who watched her like he was trying to see his own reflection." He leaned forward. "You think you're the only one haunted?" Their gazes held. "She said you made her feel seen," Mark added almost grudgingly. "Like you were looking past the stories everyone told about her. That's why she trusted you." "Why she?" he trailed off, looking away. "Why she what?" asked. Mark finished his drink in one long swallow. "Forget it. Doesn't matter now. But it did, the way he said it, the way his voice strained. It mattered more than either of them wanted it to. As drove home later, the pendant resting against his chest felt less like evidence and more like an accusation from every direction. Lydia's grief, Mark's resentment, his own restructured memories. Each person who had loved or wanted had built a version of her, could feel his own version tightening around him like a noose. The case grew heavier, not because of what they knew, but because of everything they had decided to know. And somewhere inside that tangle of need and remembrance, the truth hid, patient, waiting to see who would break first. The evidence room smelled of cardboard and forgotten intentions. Rows of metal shelving stretched into dimness, each box a sealed memory, moved through the aisles with a reverence that felt almost religious. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a washed-out pallor over everything. It was a place where years stacked on years, and the weight of what had not been solved pressed down like a second gravity. The case box sat where it always had, high up, a little apart, as if it deserved a distance even among the unresolved. He pulled it down, the cardboard rough against his palms, and set it on the table beneath the weakest light. Inside, time waited in organized decay. Photos, reports, transcripts, a small, worn notebook tied with twine, a folder labeled witness statements, another labeled scene. The neat handwriting of the lead investigator back then, Tanner Briggs, stared up at like a ghost's signature. He spread the contents out, each item a fragment of 1999 trapped in paper. The photographs came first. Outside the grocery store, arms crossed loosely, sunlight hitting her hair just so. At the diner, laughing at something off camera, the velvet pouch just visible at the edge of the frame. At a town fair, looking away from the lens, expression distant, like she already existed somewhere he couldn't follow. Arranged the photos chronologically, creating a quiet film strip on the table. The progression told a story he had read 100 times, but tonight it felt different. Under the pendant's weight, everyone else's gaze seemed suspect. Was smile for the camera, for someone behind it, for herself. He picked up the diner photo and brought it close. The velvet pouch lay near her elbow, slightly open. Inside, a suggestion of glass. The pendant, no doubt. Searched the edges of the photograph. Background details swam into focus. The pattern of the booth's upholstery, the reflection in the window, the blurred shapes of other diners. There, in the mirror behind the counter, half caught, almost accidental, was a sliver of his own younger face. He stared at it stunned. He hadn't remembered being there that night, but the image did not lie. Or did it? The angle distorted his features, turning recognition into uncertainty. Confidence, solid as stone, shifted under his feet. If he couldn't trust his memory of his own presence, what else had he rewritten? He set the photo down carefully, as if it might shatter. The notebook came next, the one tied with twine. He untied it with fingers that felt clumsy and found that it wasn't an official record. It had belonged to. He'd seen it before, decades ago, but back then it had been deemed inconclusive and filed away. A journal of sorts, but not in any linear, tidy way, just fragments. Inside were scraps of thoughts, sketches of flowers, hurried lines of handwriting scattered over pages. Some sentences ran vertically, some spiraled outward from a single word. It was as if her mind refused to march in straight lines. He flipped through slowly. The depot isn't haunted, it's just lonely.